Ryland trudged through knee-deep snow, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The icy wind sliced through his old coat, and each step made his heavy boots sink deeper. Even with gloves on, his fingers were going numb. Time was running out. His ship had crashed. His emergency beacon barely worked, and if he didn't find shelter soon, he'd freeze to death and be left for scavengers to pick over. The planet, labeled X-17 on the charts, was a frozen wasteland, always winter, always deadly, a place where smugglers and runaways disappeared never to return. His mission had completely fallen apart. Now survival was his only goal. Everywhere he looked there was nothing but endless white, snow and ice, broken only by jagged black rocks that poked out like bones from some ancient creature. Ryland tightened the scarf around his face and kept scanning the horizon, hoping to spot anything that looked like shelter. His instincts told him he wasn't alone, but out here, it was hard to tell if it was just his imagination or if something was really watching him. Then he saw it. A trail of dark red stains in the snow. Blood. Carefully, he followed the trail, his hand resting on the grip of his energy pistol. It barely had any power left, but it was all he had. The trail led him to a half-buried cave hidden beneath ice and rock. Inside it was quieter, the wind muffled, and deeper in, he found the source of the blood. She was slumped against the wall, breathing. Barely. Her fur was white, but soaked in blood. At first, Ryland thought she was just a wild animal, but when her bright blue eyes met his, he knew better. There was intelligence in those eyes. She wasn't just a creature, she was something else. Something dangerous. She had a humanoid body but covered in soft fur. Long ears twitched as she struggled to stay awake. A deep cut ran along her stomach, and smaller wounds covered her arms and legs. She had clearly been in a fight, and barely survived. Her thick, fluffy tail curled slightly around her as if trying to protect herself. Ryland hesitated only a moment. Whatever she was dying, and he couldn't just leave her there. He dropped to one knee and opened the medical kit at his belt. "Let's see what we've got here," he muttered, mostly to himself. He didn't know if she could understand him, but there was no time to figure that out. He took out bandages and healing gel, getting to work. But as soon as he touched her side, a low growl filled the cave. Her claws twitched, but she was too weak to attack. "Easy," Ryland said, calmly, locking eyes with her. "You're hurt. If I don't help, you won't make it." Her breathing was heavy, her nose twitching like she was trying to understand his scent. After a long moment, she relaxed. Just a little. That was all the permission he needed. He worked fast, patching her wounds as best he could. It wasn't perfect, but it would keep her alive for now. When he finished, he sat back, breathing heavily. Her eyes were closing. Exhaustion had finally won. Ryland looked around the cave. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. It could keep them alive through the storm. He didn't know what he'd just gotten himself into, but one thing was clear. This planet still had more surprises in store. Hours passed. The small fire Ryland had built crackled softly, filling the cave with a bit of warmth. He leaned against the stone wall, his body aching from the cold and exhaustion. But he didn't let his guard down. Across from him, the alien girl, still injured, lay curled up near the fire. Her breathing was steady, her fur rising and falling, slowly. Even though she was hurt, she looked peaceful in sleep. It felt strange. Like maybe she wasn't used to feeling safe either. Then suddenly the peace broke. In a blink she moved. One moment she was resting. Next, she was on top of him. Before Ryland could react, she had pinned him down. His back hit the cold floor with a thud, knocking the air from his lungs. Her face was just inches from his. Her glowing blue eyes burned with something wild. Her claws pressed against his shoulders, not deep, but just enough to remind him how dangerous she was. Her breathing was heavy, but her expression wasn't angry. It was intense. "You touched me," she said. Her voice, rough, low. There was something almost possessive in it. her tail wrapped around his leg, holding him in place. Rylan swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. "Yeah," he said carefully. "I helped you. You were bleeding out." Her ears twitched. She stared at him like a predator. "Now," she said softly, "you are my mate." Rylan froze. She didn't look like she was joking. She truly believed what she was saying. Even injured, she held him down like it was her right. Not to hurt, but to claim. He tried to reason with her. "That's not how this works," he said gently. "I'm a medic. I help people. It's what I do. It wasn't a ritual." She didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on his. She understood him, but she didn't care. "My kind do not owe debts," she said, voice calm. "You saved me. That makes you mine." Rylan let his head fall back, exhaling. "Great," he muttered. Now he wasn't just stuck on a frozen death planet. He was stuck with an alien werewolf who thought they were soulmates. He shifted slightly, still under her. "Look, I get it, but humans don't work like that. We don't claim people just because we put a bandage on them." She tilted her head, studying him. "Then how do your kind choose mates?" Rylan paused. That question was complicated. He tried to explain. "It takes time. We get to know each other. We build trust." She was quiet for a while, just watching him. Then she said, "You do not wish to mate?" He sighed. "It's not about wanting. It's about choice. You can't just pick someone and say they're yours." Her tail flicked, and Rylan thought, just maybe, she was amused. "You are strange," she murmured. "And you're not?" He shot back. "You jumped me 5 minutes after waking up." She huffed, breath warm against his face. Then finally, she got off him. She didn't go far, just settled back by the fire, still watching him like he might vanish if she blinked. Rylan sat up, rubbing his sore shoulders. "Okay," he said, trying to reset. "First things first. What's your name?" She blinked, surprised. She hesitated, then said, "Sarah." "All right, Sarah," Rylan nodded. "You lost a lot of blood. You need to rest before claiming anybody." Sarah narrowed her eyes but didn't argue. With a reluctant sigh, she shifted and lay down closer to the fire. "You are stubborn," she muttered. Rylan smirked. "You have no idea." The tension eased, just a little. He wasn't safe yet. But at least for now he wasn't being tackled, again. And that was a win. The fire crackled softly in the cave, casting a warm glow over the stone walls. But Rylan was only half focused on it. His eyes kept drifting to Sarah. She was still injured, still resting, but she kept watching him. Not with fear, more like curiosity, like she was trying to figure him out. That was fair. He was still trying to understand her too. Her thick fur shimmered in the firelight. Every now and then her pointed ears would twitch at sounds from the wind outside. Even while healing, she stayed alert, like a soldier ready for the next fight. She hadn't run. She hadn't attacked him again. She was still there. And that meant something, even if Rylan didn't know what. He stretched, sore from hiking through snow and the earlier misunderstanding with Sarah. But now that things had calmed, another problem was sinking in. What now? His ship was wrecked. His beacon might not work. And now he had a powerful, unpredictable alien girl watching his every move. Sarah made things more complicated. Not just because she thought he was her mate, but because he didn't know anything about her people. Did she have allies nearby? Enemies? Was she truly alone? Before he could get lost in those thoughts, Sarah shifted slightly and said, "You are troubled." Her voice was steady, calm, like the cold didn't affect her at all. Rylan glanced at her, debating if he should even answer, but she was waiting, patient, quiet, but clearly expecting something. He sighed. "Yeah, being stranded on an ice rock tends to do that." Sarah's tail twitched slightly. "You are strong, but alone. That is unwise." Rylan gave a short laugh. Tell me something. I don't know. He poked at the fire with a stick. My ship's destroyed. Supplies are low. My only hope is getting a signal out before I freeze to death. Sarah tilted her head, thinking. After a pause, she asked, You wish to leave? Her tone had changed. Quieter. Guarded. He glanced at her and noticed her ears had lowered slightly. She didn't like his answer, and for some reason, that bothered her. He sighed again. I didn't exactly choose to be here. My crew is out there somewhere. I have to try to get back. Sarah didn't reply immediately, but the way her body tensed said enough. She wasn't happy about it. Then she asked, softly, If you leave, would you return? Rylan blinked. He hadn't expected that question. She sounded hesitant, almost unsure. A side of her he hadn't seen before, and he didn't know how to answer. Because honestly, he hadn't thought that far ahead. Before he could respond, Sarah suddenly straightened, ears standing tall, her whole body going tense. Rylan's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his pistol. What is it? Sarah sniffed the air. Her expression darkened. Something comes. Rylan froze, listening, but he only heard the wind. That didn't mean she was wrong. If her senses were sharper than his, and they probably were, whatever was out there was close. He jumped to his feet, eyes on the cave entrance. He had no idea what kind of creature was coming, but he didn't want to find out too late. Sarah stood too, slower than him due to her injuries, but even weakened, she moved like a fighter. Her claws flexed at her sides, and when she stepped toward the entrance, she was silent. Like a shadow, Rylan followed, weapon raised, his heart pounding. For a moment, there was only snow and wind. Then, movement. A deep growling snarl cut through the air, and suddenly something huge lunged out of the storm, crashing into the cave. With terrifying speed, the beast slammed into the cave with such force that snow and ice rained down from the ceiling. Rylan fired his pistol without thinking, but the creature was too fast. His shot only grazed its thick, dark hide. Glowing yellow eyes locked onto them. Jaws snapped with raw power. The thing was huge, bigger than Sarah, and its fur was dirty, matted with blood that wasn't its own. Sarah didn't hesitate. In an instant, she threw herself between Rylan and the monster. Her growl filled the cave, fierce and sharp. She met the beast head-on, claws tore through the air. Fangs snapped. The cave echoed with the sounds of a brutal fight. Rylan backed up quickly, trying to get a clear shot without hitting Sarah. His heart raced. He'd seen fights before, but nothing like this. Sarah was fast, even injured. Every move she made was focused, controlled. She wasn't just attacking wildly. She was fighting to win. The creature struck back hard, but it wasn't ready for her speed. With one final savage slash, Sarah's claws ripped across its throat. The beast collapsed, twitching, then went still. Silence returned, broken only by their heavy breathing. Sarah stood over the body, her fur now soaked with fresh blood, but none of it was hers. She turned to Rylan, her eyes still glowing with energy from the fight, but behind that was something else. Possession. She stepped closer, her voice low and calm. You will not leave. Rylan swallowed hard, gripping his pistol tighter. That didn't sound like a question. He took a breath, steadying himself. She was serious. To her, saving his life meant something permanent. But he wasn't ready to let anyone control his fate, no matter how powerful they were. I appreciate the help, he said carefully, nodding toward the dead creature. Really? But I'm not staying here forever. Sarah's ears twitched. Her tail moved slowly behind her. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer, deliberate, calm. Rylan didn't back up, but every part of him was alert. You are strong, she said, more like a fact than a compliment. But you are alone, no allies, no pack. That makes you vulnerable, he let out a breath, shaking his head. It's not about what I want. It's about what's real. I've survived on my own before. I don't need a pack. Sarah tilted her head, then slowly crouched by the fire again. Her body was still tense, but not like she was about to attack, just alert. If that were true, she said softly, you would have left me to die in the snow. Rylan froze. He hadn't expected that. He clenched his jaw and looked away. That was different. Was it? She asked, her voice steady. You say you don't need others, but you chose to save one. Rylan ran a hand down his face. I did it because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted to be part of some pack. You're my mate, she said again, calm but firm. He glared at her, tired. Seriously? She huffed, half annoyed, half amused, and finally looked away, breaking eye contact. He couldn't tell if she accepted his answer, or was just waiting him out. At least the tension faded a little. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. It wasn't exactly peaceful, but it wasn't hostile either. Then, after a long pause, Sarah asked something else. Your kind, she said slowly. How do they choose? Rylan frowned. Choose? Mates, she clarified. He sighed. It's complicated. Explain, she said, not demanding, just curious. He ran a hand through his hair. Where did he even start? It's not like your kind, he said. We don't just pick someone and call them ours. It takes time. Trust. We choose each other. Sarah frowned slightly, thinking. Then she nodded. That is not so different. Rylan laughed under his breath. Feels pretty different to me. She didn't argue. Instead, she reached into a small bag by her side and took out a piece of wood, turning it over in her claws. I will not force you, she said simply. That surprised him. No pressure, no demands. Just a statement. Calm. Certain. Then she looked at him again. But you will stay, she added, her voice leaving no room for argument. Rylan sighed and leaned back against the wall. For now. Sarah's tail curled slightly, and, while she didn't smile, something in her posture looked satisfied. The fire burned low. The wind howled outside, and for the first time since he'd crashed on this icy world, Rylan wasn't sure if he wanted to leave. Rylan had spent years in war zones, patching up wounded soldiers, staying calm while chaos raged around him. But nothing had prepared him for this. Not the battles, not the near-death moments, not the endless survival training. Nothing had taught him how to handle being stuck in a cave, with an alien werewolf girl who thought he was hers. He should have been planning an escape, figuring out how to send a signal. But instead, he sat by the fire, chewing on a strip of dried rations, while Sarah calmly cleaned blood from her claws. She was still recovering, but every move she made was focused, controlled, like a warrior, waiting for the next fight. Even now, injured and quiet, she didn't relax. Not really. Rylan could tell. She wasn't just healing. She was waiting. Finally, he sighed and set his food aside. So, what happens now? Sarah looked at him, eyes sharp like always. You rest. Regain your strength. Rylan laughed lightly. That's not what I meant. He motioned toward the cave's entrance where the storm had finally calmed. What happens after this? Do you have a pack? A home to go back to? Her ears twitched at the question. For the first time since meeting her, something changed in her expression, a flicker of emotion he couldn't read. No, she said quietly. I have no pack. Rylan frowned. Why not? Sarah's claws flexed, then slowly curled into a loose fist. I left. They did not accept my choices. What choices? He asked, leaning forward. She was quiet again, choosing her words carefully. I refused a bond, she said simply. That made Rylan pause. He now understood enough to know bonds meant everything to her kind. Rejecting one, that was a big deal. Let me guess, he said, rubbing his face. They didn't take that well? Sarah huffed. a sound that almost sounded like a dry laugh. I was given a choice. Accept or leave. I left. She said it like it was no big deal. Like leaving her home, her people, her life, it was just another step. But Ryland could see it now. She had walked away from everything and survived. He looked at her more closely. Something heavy settled in his chest. He knew what that felt like. Being alone, making hard choices that cost you everything. He sat in silence for a while. Then finally he shook his head and said quietly, "You and I, we've got more in common than I thought." Sarah's ears perked slightly. Her gaze locked onto him. "You left something behind too?" she asked. Ryland scoffed, leaning back. "More than one thing." He didn't explain, and she didn't ask. She just nodded, like she understood. They sat there for a long time, not talking, not tense, just still. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was quiet, and somehow comforting. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "You still wish to leave?" This time, it wasn't a challenge, just a question. Ryland let out a breath. "I have to try." Sarah watched him carefully, then nodded once. "Then I will take you to the wreckage." Ryland blinked. He hadn't expected that. He'd been waiting for another argument, another reason she'd try to keep him here. Instead, she was offering to help. She must have seen the surprise on his face because she gave him a small, knowing smile. "Do not mistake my willingness for surrender," she said, stretching. "I am only making sure my mate survives." Ryland groaned, dragging a hand down his face. "For the last time, I know," she cut in, waving her clawed hand playfully. "Humans don't work like that." He shot her a look. "Glad we're finally getting somewhere." Her smirk didn't fade. "But you will stay long. Enough to fix your ship." That at least was true. He couldn't leave until he got it working. He sighed. "Fine. Tomorrow we head for the wreck." Sarah nodded, satisfied. "Rest. You will need strength." Ryland wanted to argue that he wasn't helpless, but honestly, he was exhausted. His body ached. His mind was tired, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. He leaned, back stretching out near the fire. Sarah curled up nearby, her thick fur shifting as she settled in. Even resting, her ears twitched at every sound. She had accepted he wanted to leave. But one thing hadn't changed. She was still watching him, still studying him. And deep down, Ryland had a strange feeling that no matter what happened next, no matter how far he went, she wasn't going to forget him. Ryland woke to the soft crackling of dying embers and the still quiet of the cave. The fire had burned low, but it was just enough to keep the freezing air away. He stretched, his muscles sore from sleeping on the cold stone floor. His body wasn't made for this kind of punishment, but he'd been through worse. What wasn't normal, though, was the warm weight pressed up against him. He looked down. Sarah. She had curled herself partly over him during the night. Her thick fur was soft and warm, her tail loosely wrapped around his leg like it belonged there. Her ears twitched in her sleep, but she didn't move away. Ryland just stared for a moment, unsure what to do. This wasn't about dominance or instinct anymore. This felt like trust, and that made it harder. He let out a quiet breath and carefully sat up, trying not to wake her. Things were already complicated. He didn't need them getting more emotional. She had made it clear how she felt, and even though she'd backed off the whole mate thing a little, that energy was still there. The tension between them hadn't disappeared, and if he was honest, he didn't hate it, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the shipwreck, the beacon, getting off this planet before he ran out of options. Ryland stood and stretched, trying to work the stiffness out of his back. Outside, the wind had settled. The sky was pale, icy, and quiet. Peaceful. Too peaceful. Behind him, Sarah stirred. Her ears flicked, her eyes opening, sharp and alert right away. She took one look at him and without a word stood up and stretched like a predator waking from a nap. Her tail flicked. Rylan could tell by her look. She knew what he had been thinking, and she found it funny. "We move," she said simply, rolling her shoulders. "Yeah," Rylan nodded. "The wreck's not far, but if anything survived the crash, and we'll need to be careful." Sarah gave a low sound of agreement and headed out of the cave into the snow without hesitation. Rylan followed, the cold biting at his skin. At least the sky was clear. They walked in silence. Their boots and paws crunching against the snow, Rylan's mind was racing, playing out best and worst case scenarios. Best case, the beacon worked, and he got a signal out. Worst case, everything was fried, and he was stuck here. Meanwhile, Sarah moved like she was hunting, alert, focused, scanning everything. Every sound, every movement in the snow. Even hurt, she was ready to fight. Rylan found himself watching her more than he meant to. She was so different from anyone he had ever met. Not just in looks, in everything. She was a warrior, a survivor. But there was a quiet strength to her too. A kind of calm thoughtfulness hiding under all the instinct and muscle. They traveled for hours before the wreck came into view. Half buried in the snow, metal torn and scattered like bones across the ice. Rylan's heart jumped. He picked up the pace. He rushed to what was left of the cockpit and dug through broken panels until his fingers touched something intact. The beacon. It was cracked, but not completely destroyed. He powered it on. Screen flickered once, then died. No, come on, he muttered, shaking it, trying every trick he knew. Sarah watched silently, not interfering, just letting him work. He needed a power source, something small and steady. He cursed under his breath. If he couldn't get this beacon working, he was out of options. Then Sarah knelt beside him and reached into a satchel he hadn't noticed before. She pulled out something small and metallic, no bigger than his palm, and handed it to him. Rylan turned it over in his hands. A power cell. Sleek. Alien. But fully charged. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. "I took it," she said simply. "From who?" Her tail flicked and her voice cooled slightly. "A traitor. He no longer needed it." Rylan didn't ask more. He wasn't sure he wanted the details. Instead, he focused on the device. "This might work," he said, carefully opening the beacon's casing. "It's not a perfect fit, but I can make it work." Sarah watched, quiet, tail curling slowly behind her. "This will call your people?" she asked. "If it works, yeah," she was quiet again. Then finally said softer, "And then you will leave." Rylan's hands stilled. He had been so focused on fixing the beacon, he hadn't thought about what would come after. He rubbed the back of his neck. "That's the idea." Sarah's posture changed. Not angry, not surprised, just heavier. She had always known this was temporary, and yet for the first time Rylan wondered, what if leaving now was a mistake? Rylan worked in silence, forcing himself to focus on the beacon instead of the fact that Sarah had walked away without a word. She had said, "I will hunt." Just that. Then she disappeared into the snow like a shadow. He should have felt relieved. Space, to think, to focus. But instead her absence felt heavy. Like something important had left the cave. The power cell she gave him was advanced, more than he expected. And that raised questions he hadn't asked. About her past, about what she wasn't saying. He sighed and kept working. He stripped wires, adjusted circuits, and rerouted power to bypass the damaged systems. It had to work. If this beacon didn't send a signal, he'd be stuck here with no backup, no escape. He flipped the switch. Nothing. Then, a low hum. The screen flickered to life. Dim, but working. Rylan's heart jumped. It wasn't much, but it was hope. He quickly set the emergency signal to loop on all frequencies. Then he waited. The wind picked up outside. The fire he'd built was burning. Low. No response yet. He checked his weapons, counted the last of his rations, tried not to think about what would happen if the signal failed. Then, a sound. Not the wind. Something else. A low growl, steady and deliberate, getting closer. He stood, pistol ready, scanning the snowy horizon. Shapes moved through the storm. Large, fast, organized. Not wild animals, not scavengers, predators. A pack. Ryland's stomach turned. They were like Sarah, but different. 4 of them. Surrounding the wreckage, moving in slow, careful steps. Then one stepped forward, broad shoulders, dark fur, eyes like molten gold, the leader. Human, he said in a deep, cold voice. You are far from home. Ryland didn't lower his weapon. Didn't exactly plan this trip. The leader bared his teeth, half smile, half warning. You are with the exile. Ryland's grip tightened. If you mean the one who saved my life, yeah. She does not belong to you, the leader said flatly. She doesn't belong to anyone, Ryland replied. The pack shifted behind him, tense, testing, watching. The leader stared for a long time, then said, Sarah is ours. She was given a choice. She made the wrong one. Ryland clenched his jaw. What do you want with her? The leader stepped closer. She has what is ours. We've come to take it back. Before Ryland could react, she was there. Sarah appeared from the snow, like she'd never left. Her fur dusted with frost, her breath slow but steady. She didn't run. She came to face them. The pack shifted again but didn't attack. Not yet. Sarah looked at Ryland first. There was something like regret in her eyes. Then she turned to the leader. You shouldn't have come, she said. You know why we're here, he replied. I do. Ryland's chest tightened. He could feel it. This wasn't just a threat. This was personal. The leader bared his teeth. Then you know how this ends. Sarah didn't blink. Not like last time. The storm howled behind them. The beacon blinked quietly beside him. Ryland knew whatever happened next would change everything. Ryland kept his pistol steady, but he knew this wasn't the time to shoot. Not yet. The pack had numbers. Sarah was still healing. If a fight broke out now, they might not make it out alive. Sarah stood tall beside him, calm but alert. Her tail flicked once, a quiet sign of tension. The pack leader, her old packmate, stared at her with cold patience, like someone who believed he already had the upper hand. You broke the bond, he said. You left your place among us. His golden eyes shifted to Ryland, like he wasn't a threat, just a problem. And now you protect this human? Sarah didn't flinch. I made my choice. I don't regret it. The leader stepped forward. Without thinking, Ryland moved too, just slightly in front of her. He didn't touch her, didn't say anything, but he made it clear. He wasn't stepping aside. The leader noticed. His eyes narrowed, studying Ryland with a different kind of interest now. Not anger. Something else. And yet, here you stand, he said to Sarah. She clenched her jaw. I will not go back. The pack behind the leader shifted again. Their claws flexed. The air was thick with tension. She is no longer one of us, another packmate growled. His fur was darker, his posture aggressive. She has no right to our protection. Sarah's ears twitched, but her face stayed unreadable. I never asked for it. Ryland's patience snapped. He didn't know the full history, but he knew one thing. He wasn't letting them take her. He stepped forward, voice calm, but firm. If she's not one of you anymore, then why are you here? It was a simple question, but it made the second packmate growl again. He started toward Ryland, claws ready. The leader raised a hand to stop him. You do not understand our ways, the leader said. She belongs with us, whether she wants to or not. Ryland's jaw tightened. She already made her decision. The Leader looked at him long and hard. And you believe this is your decision too? Yeah, Rylan said without hesitation. Sarah glanced at him briefly. Her face unreadable, but something in her eyes shifted. The leader tilted his head. And if we take her? Rylan gave a humorless laugh. You can try. The second packmate didn't wait for permission this time. He lunged, but Sarah was faster. She slammed into him mid-strike, claws flashing. They crashed into the snow in a blur of snarls and fury. The leader didn't flinch. He'd expected this. His focus stayed on Rylan. You fight for her, he said. Rylan aimed his pistol at him. Damn. Right I do. The leader looked at him for a long second, then did something Rylan didn't expect. He stepped back. Not in fear, not in surrender, just something else. You're willing to challenge our claim, the leader said. That makes you either a fool or something more. Rylan kept his pistol up. Try me. The leader's lips twitched, almost a smirk. Not today. He turned his head. Enough. Sarah was mid-strike, ready to end the fight, but at his command she froze. Just long enough for her opponent to scramble away. The leader's gaze was steady. She made her choice once. I came to see if she would make it again. He looked at Sarah. She has. Sarah stayed silent, chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. This is not over, the leader said. But there was no threat in his tone. Only certainty. We won't come for her again. But she is no longer one of us. She will not find safety in our territory. Sarah's voice was calm. I never needed it. The leader held her gaze one last time. Then he turned. The others followed, though the one Sarah had nearly torn apart gave Rylan a look full of hatred before disappearing into the snow. And just like that, they were gone. Rylan lowered his pistol, slowly exhaling. Sarah didn't move. She stood there, fists clenched, still breathing hard. She had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. Finally, Rylan spoke. You okay? Sarah let out a breath, softer, now. I am free. Her voice wasn't angry. Or sad. Just true. Rylan nodded. Good. The beacon still blinked behind them, and for the first time since all this started, Rylan knew exactly what his next move was. The wind howled across the frozen plains, but Rylan didn't feel the cold anymore. The pack was gone, Sarah was free. The fight was over. But the weight of it all still hung in the air. He had stood by her, not because he had to, not because of some bond, but because he wanted to. That truth sat heavy and real in his chest. Sarah stood beside him, tense and silent. Her breathing slowed, her body still ready for another attack, even though it wouldn't come. She had no pack now, no one to go back to. But when she turned to look at Rylan, there was no fear in her expression. There was something steadier, something certain. You are still here, she said quietly, her voice barely louder than the wind. Rylan exhaled and rolled his shoulders. Yeah. Where else would I be? She studied him, not speaking for a moment. Then she said, You have what you need. The beacon, the signal. Soon your people will come. He knew what she was doing, trying to push him away before he could choose to leave. It was something he had seen before, people trying to let go before they got hurt. She expected him to walk away, because that's what everyone else had done. Rylan crossed his arms. Yeah, the beacon's working, but that doesn't mean I'm just going to vanish when a ship shows up. Sarah's ears twitched. She didn't look away. You are not bound to me. Rylan laughed quietly. You keep saying that like I ever needed to be. He stepped closer, voice calm but serious. I didn't fight for you because I had to. I didn't stand by you because of instinct or tradition. He looked her in the eyes. I did it because I wanted to. Sarah blinked. Something shifted. In her face, something unsure. like she didn't know how to handle that. Rylan could see it. She was bracing for rejection, waiting for him to walk away. But he didn't. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I don't know what happens next. Maybe my people come, maybe they don't, but until we figure that out, I'm not going anywhere. Sarah narrowed her eyes slightly. You would stay? Rylan gave her a crooked smile. I've been stuck here this long. What's a little longer? She blinked at him, then huffed, a quiet breath that almost sounded like amusement. You are stubborn. He smirked. So are you. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't cold or tense. It felt like something real. Rylan had never been good at big speeches or emotional moments. But standing there, in that icy wasteland, he knew one thing. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about choice. Sarah tilted her head, her sharp blue eyes searching his face. Your kind, they choose their mates? She asked softly. Rylan swallowed. Yeah. She stepped closer. Her presence was warm, even in the cold. Her voice was steady, but underneath it was something else. Hope. Then I ask you now, human, she said quietly. Do you choose me? Rylan didn't hesitate. Yes. Sarah exhaled slowly, and then she moved. She stepped forward, pressed against him. Her head lowered slightly, her nose brushing the side of his neck. The touch was gentle, almost instinctual, like her people didn't use words for moments like this. Rylan tensed, just for a second. Then he relaxed into her. His arms wrapped around her naturally. She was warm, solid, real. She let out a low sound, deep in her chest, something pleased. He laughed quietly against her fur. You still think I'm fragile? You are, she replied without missing a beat. He rolled his eyes, smiling. Sure, whatever you say. They stayed like that, wrapped in silence, while the wind moved around them. For once, it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning. Finally, Sarah pulled back, her eyes steady. Her tail curled gently around his leg again, but this time he didn't pull away. You will not regret this, she said softly. Rylan smirked. I know. Behind them, the beacon still blinked. Still, calling into the stars. Maybe help would come. Maybe they'd leave this frozen place together, or maybe they'd stay. Build something here. Whatever happened. For the first time in a long time, Rylan wasn't just surviving. He was choosing to live. And he wasn't doing it alone. Rylan woke to the soft crackle of the fire and the cold quiet of early morning. The beacon's light blinked slowly beside him, still sending out its signal into space. He stretched, joints sore but not unbearable. He was used to discomfort. What he wasn't used to was warmth pressed against his side. Sarah, her fur lay softly against him. Her head rested near his shoulder. Her tail was still gently wrapped around his leg like it belonged there. She didn't stir. She trusted him. That part hit harder than he expected. This wasn't about claiming or instinct, not anymore. This was comfort, trust, connection, and it scared him a little. Carefully, he shifted out from under her without waking her. He needed air. He needed time to think. He stepped outside, the wreckage. The snow had stopped. The sky above was pale and still, beautiful in a quiet, dangerous way, but peaceful too. Behind him, Sarah stirred, her eyes opened, immediately alert, scanning for threats. When she saw him, she didn't speak. She just stood and stretched, calm and steady. We move, she said, same as always. Yeah. Rylan nodded. The beacon's working, but we'll have to wait. If anyone's out there, they'll come looking. Could take hours. Maybe more. Sarah didn't complain. They passed the time working, gathering supplies, checking the wreckage again. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. When they finally sat together near the fire again, Rylan felt it. The calm between them wasn't just safety. It was something deeper. You rely on machines, she said quietly, watching the beacon. Pulse. We have to, he replied. Your kind has claws, teeth, strength. We build tools. It's how we survive. Sarah was silent for a moment. Then she nodded. And yet, you are still here. He looked at her. So are you. Later, she asked what he would do if a ship came. Go back, he said. Find my people. She didn't answer at first. Then, would you return? That question again. Rylan didn't respond right away. He didn't know how to promise something when the future was still so unclear. Before he could speak, she stood. I will hunt, she said softly, and walked into the snow. He watched her disappear into the white. Alone, Rylan returned to the beacon, adjusted the signal, sat in silence. He realized something then. It didn't feel right without her nearby. She came back a while later, quiet as ever. Her arms full of supplies, and beside her another surprise, a small creature, half frozen, weak, barely alive. She had saved it. He helped patch it up without asking questions, because that's who they were now. Two people who saved others, even in a world that didn't give them much in return. That night they sat by the fire again, shoulders close. No words, just warmth, and a choice that no longer needed to be spoken. Whatever came next, rescue or no rescue, they wouldn't face it. Alone, and in that cold, brutal world that meant everything.